The Last of Us showed us how the world ended, but how does regular life look like after that? In the show we see the fights for immediate survival, first colonies and cults. But imagine living in a world after the apocalypse for many years, maybe decades. When thinking about that, I had a lot of questions. What happens to art, to history, to truth, and many more elements of life when the world keeps turning, but civilization doesn't? This video dives into 10 questions the show brings up but never answered. Questions that aren't about how you survive the apocalypse, but how you live in it. And surprisingly, the answers hint at something very unsettling for our real world today. The specific scene that made me go down this rabbit hole was when Isaac interrogated a Seraphite. He talks about how he was always dreaming about these fancy pans before the apocalypse. Now, obviously, he doesn't anymore. But what do people dream about in the world of The Last of Us? When they were born years after the apocalypse, would they even know what other life might be possible? We'll get into all of that, but let's start with the first question that came to mind in this specific scene. What happens to all the stuff we cared so much about? For instance, art. In the post-apocalyptic world, like in The Last of Us, the fate of art is precarious and deeply revealing. We see remnants of pre-collapse art, statues, paintings, murals, concert flyers, but their cultural context has vanished. Art objects in museums or abandoned homes may still exist physically, but whether they retain meaning depends on the community that finds them. In a society where survival is paramount, aesthetic value is often overridden by utility. Would someone steal a painting from a museum? Possibly, but not for display. In The Last of Us, survivors are more likely to strip paintings for canvas or burn furniture for firewood. A sculpture might become a barricade. Art pieces in a world like that would seem pointless. However, not everyone disregards them. Some groups might preserve art as sacred relics, especially if they symbolize pre-apocalyptic civilization. The Fireflies, who claim to fight for a better future, might view such artifacts as emblems for what they are trying to save. Art would become propaganda for their cause. In contrast, raiders or militarized factions may ignore or even destroy art as meaningless decoration from a dead world, or even a threat to their new world order. Will people still make art? Yes, but its form and function will change. Ellie's love of guitar playing is personal and nostalgic, not performative. Drawing, tattooing, carving initials into walls, these small acts are more likely than oil painting or sculpture. In Bill and Frank's town, we see domestic beautification. Matching plates, tidy tables, music. These acts of aesthetic choice are not indulgent. They are declarations of humanity. Some may create art to cope with trauma or to teach children about the past. Others may simply make it to mark time or territory. In these ways, art becomes deeply personal and symbolic in a small, local context. Anthropologically, we know that art persists even in the harshest conditions. Cave paintings were made in survival-based societies. The difference post-apocalypse is that the institutions of art, galleries, schools, critics, no longer exist. Art becomes either memory or ritual, depending on who finds it. We can safely assume that the vast majority of people won't look at museums for prestige. They'll ignore it or dismantle it. Art made afterward will be personal, therapeutic, or maybe religious. Its survival will depend on whether communities value it as cultural memory, not economic capital. But if art becomes scattered fragments, what happens to the stories behind it? What happens to history? In The Last of Us, history is fragmented, local, and fading fast. Most adults remember the world before the outbreak, how cities worked, what governments did, and who invented what. But to a teenager born after the collapse, these stories sound mythological. Just like history to Gen Z today. Boomer humor, gotta love it. The further society drifts from year zero, the more history becomes hearsay. Will people still know about history before the apocalypse? For a generation, yes. But if the apocalypse occurred 15 or 20 years ago, as it has in The Last of Us, formal history begins to erode. Without schools, historians, or textbooks, knowledge becomes selective and community dependent. Children might know about dinosaurs, but not the Cold War. They might know the world had planes once, but not why World War I happened. In small communities and tribes, oral history becomes paramount. In Jackson, Ellie learns about the moon landing from Joel. In the Seraphite cult, history is reinvented entirely around a central prophet. Historical truth becomes plural and ideological. One town might revere pre-apocalypse science, another might reject it as hearsay. Geographic distance reinforces this. A community in Jackson might preserve American founding myths, while one in Oregon might center their lore around the outbreak itself. What about other places in the world? This is one of the show's mysteries and one of the most haunting questions. Without global communication, history becomes provincial. Survivors in Wyoming don't know if Australia is still habitable. Is there a civilization still standing in Africa? Has Asia rebuilt? In a globalized world turned silent, the only history that matters is the one within walking distance. And if history becomes fractured and rumor-driven, what does that mean for the flow of real-time information? In a world without the internet, smartphones, or mass media, information becomes oral, slow, and often unreliable. The Last of Us shows how people rely on radio signals, handwritten notes, graffiti, and rumor to understand the world around them. How do you get information about other people in other places? The short answer, you probably don't. Word of mouth is the dominant mode. In Jackson, scouts report on outside events, on high risks to their own lives. Also, only the events that imminently represent a threat to the community would matter. No one would care who had a gender reveal a couple of miles over, just as today. In Boston QZ, Fedra's loudspeakers control information flow. Most survivors trust what they see firsthand. Anything else is suspicion or superstition. What kind of information is useful? Practical intel. Where infected are spotted, where water is safe, what towns still trade. Gossip is rarely idle, it's strategic. Who's armed, who's allied, who's a threat? Does information travel at all? Barely. Without postal services or media, information piggybacks on human travel. One trader might carry a rumor hundreds of miles, but accuracy degrades. A tip about a safe comp becomes a false promise. Hope mutates into disappointment. In this context, information is often dangerous. A misstep can lead to ambush or exposure. Communities develop their own hierarchies of trust. Some might designate a listener or archivist. Others might treat maps or journals as sacred, but as most records degrade or get destroyed, each group becomes epistemologically isolated. What they believe becomes what they know. But even without news, ideology doesn't die. When the internet goes silent, do politics disappear too? Political ideology does not vanish with the collapse of institutions. Instead, it mutates with the people. In The Last of Us, the remnants of pre-apocalyptic political culture live on in fragmented, often militarized forms. The major political parties are gone, as are the elections and culture wars that once shaped public discourse. But ideological differences persist in subtler and sometimes more extreme forms. Do people still hold beliefs? Absolutely. Ideology endures, often hardened by trauma and defined by necessity. Some believe in rebuilding civilization, like the Fireflies. Others in isolation and self-defense, like Bill and David's cult. And others in religious fundamentalism, like the Seraphites. In Season 2, we even see a man taking offense by affection between Ellie and Dina. So maybe bigotry survives even the apocalypse. Wow. These beliefs inform governance, moral codes, and justice systems in each faction. Are people still for or against things politically? Yes, but the stakes are immediate. It's not about healthcare policy or tax reform. It's about whether to trust strangers, whether to share food, whether to risk lives for medicine. Oh wow, just like today. Debates over safety versus openness, tradition versus change, or individualism versus community are all inherently political, even if there's no longer a ballot box. What takes the place of politics? power structures. Some are overtly authoritarian, like Fedra, others theocratic, like the Seraphites, and others consensus-driven, like Jackson. The left-right spectrum dissolves into survival philosophies. What remains is politics in the purest form. Who leads, who decides, who eats. And if politics becomes survival, then even our measurement of time may become unrecognizable. So what does time look like in the apocalypse? Without clocks, schools, or weekends, time becomes subjective, measured by sunrise, seasons, and suffering. The Last of Us shows how survivors revert to natural rhythms. Day and night, spring and winter, feast and famine. What happens when weekends don't exist anymore? Calendars lose meaning. Time becomes functional. No one says TGIF, instead they ask, when does the patrol leave? Or how long has it been since the last attack? How do people orient themselves? Noon becomes a marker for travel. Moonlight dictates movement. A child may not know their birth date, but they know the season of rationing or the winter of infection. Time becomes tied to lived experience, not to a calendar, but to memory. What other aspects of time matter? Cyclical markers become sacred. The anniversary of a loved one's death, the planting season, the time of year when the infected migrate. People create emotional calendars instead of industrial ones. In Jackson, birthdays and anniversaries are still honored, a rare luxury in a broken world. Ultimately, the collapse doesn't just distort time, it dislocates it. Time without a future is just repetition. That's why stories, songs, and rituals become so important. They anchor people into something bigger than a never-ending now. When even time is rationed, comfort becomes unthinkable. So what counts as luxury in a world like this? In the apocalypse, luxury is no longer about extravagance. It's about scarcity, safety, and memory. In The Last of Us, luxury isn't a Rolex or a yacht, it's a soft bed, a guitar, a moment alone. But all of those things would not feel like luxury, they would feel like peace. A brief moment of peace. The concept of luxury will disappear and will be replaced. If money doesn't matter anymore, what does? Status is no longer about what you buy, it's about what you have that others don't. Medicine, hot water, clean socks, a working shower maybe. These become coveted. What once was luxury is now comfort plus rarity. Is comfort itself a luxury? No, it's neglect. Comfort lowers your guard. To lie down in peace is to risk dying in your sleep. That's why true luxury will not be a thing. It's a feeling that in a world like this has no place. But what does luxury mean symbolically? It becomes a memory. A wedding ring, a record player, a bottle of aged wine. Even something useless like a stuffed toy or a dress takes on immense value. Not because it serves a purpose, but because it reminds someone they are still human. People who lived before the apocalypse will remember luxury the way we remember leaving our doors unlocked at night. They won't believe people were able to do that. But survival is not just about comfort, it's about knowledge. So what happens to knowledge itself? In a world without schools, servers, or scholars, knowledge is triaged. In The Last of Us, practical knowledge survives. How to gut a deer, purify water, wire a generator. Abstract knowledge like algebra, history, or ethics becomes endangered. Will we all be dumb? Not necessarily, but literacy and education change. Children learn by doing. Knowledge becomes embodied, not institutional. Ellie learns about the past through storytelling, not textbooks. Wikipedia, a dead icon. Can someone keep knowledge alive? In theory, yes. Someone might download Wikipedia to a solar-powered tablet, but when that tablet breaks, so does the archive. That's the fragility of digital memory. And what knowledge will matter at all? Anything that helps you live. Medicine, engineering, farming, weapon repair. Philosophy survives if it helps people stay sane. But Latin conjugations and quantum physics? Gone. How do we educate children? Well, through mentorship, oral tradition, and observation. Communities will value knowledge if they build institutions, even small ones. Otherwise, the past becomes rumor, and the next generation grows up clever but unlettered. But without shared education, how do people agree on rules? What does justice look like after the fall? Laws don't disappear. they decentralize. In The Last of Us, every community has rules. In Jackson, there are town meetings. In Boston QZ, there's martial law. Among raiders, there's the rule of fear. Among Seraphites, there's prophecy. Are laws written down? Sometimes, but often they are oral, a code of conduct enforced by the group. Don't steal, don't hoard, don't turn infected, and hide it. In small groups, laws emerge from lived experience. The fewer people, the simpler the rules. Who enforces them? Usually whoever holds power. Militia, elders, or charismatic leaders. Justice can be swift, harsh, and personal. There are no appeals, jail might be exile, a trial might be a conversation at gunpoint. What determines the value of law? Its function. A law survives if it keeps people alive. If it doesn't, it dies. Communities adapt quickly. If a rule leads to unrest or starvation, it's abandoned. Justice becomes a reflection of survival, and sometimes of revenge. But justice is rooted in understanding, and understanding requires science. So what happens to science when society collapses? Science in The Last of Us is dormant, not dead. The Fireflies attempt the cure but lack the tools. Laboratories are ruins. Universities are shells. Yet, basic science, chemistry, biology, engineering endures in fragments. Will we be more adept at mechanics? Yes. Applied science thrives. People learn how to build traps, fix cars, filter water. They scavenge old tech and improvise. Science becomes practical, less about discovery, more about adaptation. Will there be research? Rarely, but not never. A community with a scientist might attempt experiments. They might study cordyceps mutations or medicinal herbs, but without infrastructure, progress is glacial. Science retreats to where it began, observation and trial and error. What if a community has a scientist? That person becomes a treasure, a living library, but they are only as useful as their tools, and their tools are only as useful as the society that supports them. Without operation, even genius is wasted. And yet, in the silence between experiments and survival, people still dream. But what exactly do they dream of? Hope is not a luxury, it's a survival tool. In The Last of Us, people hope for different things. A cure, a family, a future. Joel hopes for redemption. Ellie hopes for closure. Even the Seraphites hope in their own way for transcendence. But if the world never gets better, what if generation after generation people only know danger, the sound of boots on the snow, the shape of a rifle, the smell of rot? Eventually the idea of peace might become unthinkable, not just unlikely, but unimaginable. Like cave dwellers who never dreamed of skyscrapers or airplanes, post-apocalyptic survivors might forget that a life without fear was ever real. If you are born into a world of threat, how would you even picture safety? What would you fantasize about if your mind can't conceive anything softer than survival? Hope then shifts, away from abstract dreams and toward tiny acts of defiance. Planting a seed, telling a joke, playing a broken guitar. These aren't gestures toward a better world, they are the world. The longer the apocalypse stretches, the more hope stops being about the future and becomes about refusing to surrender the present. The story doesn't end with rebuilding, it continues in the fragments. The smile in danger, the kindness in scarcity. The Last of Us is fiction, but the questions it asks aren't. Because even without the apocalypse, many of the things we explored are already slipping away. Art, more and more created by algorithms, judged by metrics, creative expression drowned in content. Museums defunded, schools cutting music and art lessons. History, rewritten in real time, fragmented by ideology and forgotten in the favor of trend. Our collective memory, outsourced to digital servers that few of us control. Information, abundant but unreliable. Truth buried beneath engagement farming and partisan echo chambers. Trust in institutions eroded. Time collapsing into 24/7 productivity cycles. The weekday-weekend rhythm blurred by gig work, burnout, and dopamine loops. Luxury no longer achievable for the masses through their own work. Luxury for the majority already today is rest or peace. Hope still here, but increasingly rebranded as hustle. Optimism outsourced to branding campaigns. Real hope, the kind that's quiet, human, defiant, is harder to find. And most crucially, are we still hoping for a better world? Or are we simply comparing better and worse outcomes across different dystopian futures? We don't live in the apocalypse, but we're watching civilization's scaffolding fray. The Last of Us isn't just a story about after, it's a mirror of before, of now. The real question is, what will we forget before the world even ends? Or maybe did the apocalypse already happen and we didn't even notice? Maybe I should make a video about that. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more, like, comment your thoughts below, or consider subscribing. It really does help the channel a bunch. And if you're interested in another video about The Last of Us and the question, is it at all moral to simply survive? Click here. See you next time.
Sometimes love is a river running strong.